He wanted to ruin her in court, but her unexpected move made him beg for forgiveness. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the case number was called. Hannah sat quietly at her table, trying to steady her breathing while her ex-husband, Gregory, strutted in with a smug grin, flanked by two sharply dressed lawyers. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Hannah's hands trembled slightly under the table, but her face remained composed. This was the beginning of the legal battle Gregory had insisted on turning into a public spectacle. Divorce wasn't enough for him, he wanted revenge. As the proceedings started, Gregory's lawyer launched into a fiery speech about Hannah's irresponsibility, claiming she had manipulated Gregory, wasted their money, and now dared to demand full custody and spousal support. Hannah listened, each word slicing into her like paper cuts. She glanced at her own lawyer, a kind but inexperienced attorney assigned through legal aid, whose posture shrank more with every accusation. When it was Hannah's turn to speak, Gregory crossed his arms and leaned back, clearly expecting nothing meaningful. But she spoke gently, without tears or drama, describing her contributions to their family, her role in raising their daughter, and the years she supported Gregory while he built his company. Still, the judge seemed unconvinced. As the session ended, Gregory turned to her with a whisper only she could hear, "You're going to walk out of here with nothing. That's what you deserve." Their relationship hadn't always been so bitter. In the early days, Gregory had been charming, ambitious, full of ideas and energy. Hannah, then a marketing coordinator at a small agency, had been drawn to his drive and apparent vulnerability. He'd told her she was the only one who truly understood him, the only person who saw the man beneath the bravado. They married within a year, and Hannah gave up her job to help Gregory start his real estate business. She handled the paperwork, managed early deals, and organized their finances, while he met with investors and projected the image of a self-made genius. To outsiders, they were the perfect couple, young, dynamic, climbing the ladder of success together. But behind closed doors, things shifted. Gregory became impatient, critical, and dismissive. He mocked Hannah's ideas, refused to share financial decisions, and gradually shut her out from the business they had built side by side. When she raised concerns, he accused her of being insecure and ungrateful. Their conversations became one-sided lectures, and her opinions were either ignored or twisted into proof of her supposed emotional instability. Hannah tried to adapt, thinking perhaps he was just stressed or overwhelmed. But the warmth that once drew her in was now reserved for clients, colleagues, and carefully curated social media posts. At home, she felt invisible. Hannah had always been resilient, but resilience begins to crumble when it goes unrecognized. She found herself second-guessing everything, from the groceries she bought to how she dressed. Gregory criticized her for gaining weight after childbirth, for not being presentable at business events, yet never offered to help raise their daughter or manage the home. When she suggested couples therapy, he laughed. "Therapy is for broken people," he said, looking at her like she was one of them. The nights were the worst. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when the man she married had turned into a stranger, or if she had simply never seen him clearly before. It wasn't just emotional distance that grew between them. Financial secrecy also became a weapon. Gregory moved funds without explanation, made her sign documents she barely understood, and began putting assets solely under his name. When she questioned it, he called her paranoid. Soon, even the house they lived in was no longer in both their names. Hannah felt herself slowly dissolving, not just in her marriage but in her own identity. She tried to find joy in raising their daughter, in small routines, in friendships that Gregory increasingly discouraged. Every time she tried to reach out for help, she'd remember his threats. "Leave, and I'll destroy you." I'll make sure no one believes a word you say. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Hannah discovered the first of Gregory's secrets. Their daughter had left her tablet charging in the home office, and Hannah stepped in to retrieve it. On the desk sat Gregory's work laptop, open and unattended, the screen glowing with an email thread. Curiosity wasn't the reason she looked. It was survival. The subject line read "Transfer Strategy, off the books." The emails detailed transactions, shell companies, and expenses that had never appeared in their tax filings. He was funneling money into accounts overseas, accounts she never knew existed. Her breath caught in her throat. She took photos of every page. That night, she didn't confront him. She acted as though nothing had changed, cooked dinner, and read bedtime stories to their daughter. But inside, a fire was lit. Over the following weeks, Hannah began collecting everything: bank statements, credit card bills, emails, even screenshots of Gregory's late-night messages to a woman named Sylvia. It was overwhelming, painful, and terrifying. But with every folder she created, every document she saved, she started to feel something she hadn't felt in years: control. Gregory had built a fortress of lies, confident that Hannah was too weak or scared to challenge him. What he hadn't anticipated was how powerful a quiet woman becomes when she realizes the truth is on her side. The final fracture came during a charity gala Gregory insisted they attend. He paraded Hannah around like a trophy, then disappeared with his colleagues for drinks while she stood alone at the corner of the ballroom. When she finally found him again, he was laughing loudly with Sylvia, a woman Hannah had seen once before, at their daughter's school recital. Sylvia's hand was on his chest, and Gregory didn't move it. When he caught Hannah's gaze, he didn't flinch. He simply smirked and walked away. It wasn't just public humiliation. It was a declaration. He didn't care who saw. He had already discarded her in his mind. Driving home that night, Hannah gripped the steering wheel tightly while Gregory scrolled through his phone beside her, oblivious. She remembered the man who once cried in her arms, who once told her he couldn't live without her. That man was gone, if he ever truly existed. When they got home, she tucked their daughter into bed, then walked into the office, locked the door, and opened the folders. The next morning, while Gregory was at the gym, Hannah made her first call to a lawyer. "He's hiding assets, he's cheating, and he wants full custody," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "But I'm going to fight." When Hannah finally told Gregory she wanted a separation, he didn't even pretend to be surprised. He leaned back in his chair, lips curled in amusement, and said, "Go ahead, but don't think you'll get a penny, or the kid." That moment shattered whatever was left of their fragile peace. He made it clear he wouldn't accept the divorce quietly. Instead, he was going to wage war. He immediately contacted a well-known legal firm and filed first, framing Hannah as mentally unstable and neglectful, crafting a narrative so twisted it stunned even her lawyer. What had been an internal nightmare suddenly became a public battlefield. Neighbors, mutual friends, even teachers at their daughter's school began treating Hannah differently. Gregory was charismatic, wealthy, and persuasive. He'd show up with flowers at school events and mention that he was worried about how Hannah was coping. With just a few subtle insinuations, he turned sympathy into suspicion. Hannah was forced to walk through her own neighborhood with whispers trailing behind her, wondering how many people believed she was losing her mind. Every day felt like a performance in damage control, and Gregory was the one writing the script. But behind closed doors, she continued building her case, determined to take back her story. At the next court date, Gregory's lawyers presented their opening statements with calculated precision. They accused Hannah of financial mismanagement, emotional volatility, and parental negligence. Hannah sat expressionless as lies were presented like facts, her reputation unraveling in front of strangers. Gregory sat smugly, occasionally glancing at her, as if gauging how far she would let him go. Her lawyer did their best, but with limited experience and little access to resources, the imbalance was painfully obvious. The judge appeared neutral, but something in their tone hinted at doubt toward Hannah. That was the hardest part. She wasn't just losing ground, she was losing credibility. At home, Hannah cried only once. After that, she transformed her pain into focus. She stopped reacting emotionally to Gregory's provocations and began preparing for the long game. She reviewed every document he filed, cross-referenced dates, highlighted contradictions, and kept meticulous notes. She reached out to a new lawyer, someone recommended by a woman in a support group who had survived a similar war. This new attorney was direct and calm, and after reading Hannah's documentation, simply said, "You've been underestimated." That sentence stayed with her. It wasn't comfort. It was confirmation. She wasn't crazy. She was ready. As Gregory's campaign intensified, Hannah found herself more alone than ever. People who once called her for brunch, sent holiday cards, or smiled at pickup time began avoiding eye contact or cutting conversations short. One of her closest friends, Amelia, finally confessed, "Gregory told us you were having breakdowns. That you left your daughter alone at night to go out." Hannah stood frozen. Not because it was shocking, she expected it by now, but because Amelia had believed it. That betrayal stung more than Gregory's lies ever could. It confirmed that image could matter more than truth. Gregory wore tailored suits and practiced his charm like a script. Hannah wore exhaustion and carried her dignity in silence. Even her own parents urged caution. "Just give him what he wants," her mother said. "You're not going to win against someone like him." But Hannah had crossed the point of no return. She wasn't fighting for revenge. She was fighting for her daughter's future and her own right to exist with truth on her side. The more isolated she became, the more her resolve deepened. Loneliness, after all, was familiar. But now it had a purpose. Hannah spent her nights organizing files, reviewing audio recordings she discreetly saved from arguments, and tracking Gregory's digital trail. She no longer cried. She strategized. The day the judge issued a temporary custody ruling, Hannah felt her knees nearly give out. Gregory was granted primary custody until further notice. The justification? Stability. He owned the home, had a higher income, and claimed Hannah had emotional inconsistencies. Their daughter, Abby, cried when Hannah explained she'd be spending weekdays with her father now. Hannah held her close, whispering that it wasn't forever. But the look on Abby's face haunted her for days, a quiet confusion that pierced deeper than any court document ever could. Gregory, of course, acted gracious about it. "It's for her own good," he said loudly at pickup, making sure other parents heard. "Until her mother can get her life together." That night, Hannah sat on the floor of her empty apartment, clutching Abby's stuffed toy. It was the first night in years without the sound of her daughter's laughter filling the space. But rather than collapse under the weight of the decision, Hannah picked herself up, walked to her computer, and reviewed the timeline her new attorney had asked her to build. There were still gaps in the documentation, but something was starting to form. A pattern. A trail. A truth that couldn't be ignored. She didn't know when the tides would turn, but she knew one thing: Gregory's arrogance would leave footprints. All she had to do was follow them. The morning after her first major legal loss, Hannah scheduled a meeting with her new attorney, Melissa Graham. Melissa was different from any legal professional Hannah had met, sharp, observant, and unafraid to say exactly what she thought. After reviewing Hannah's folders, Melissa leaned back in her chair and said, "Gregory made a mistake. He pushed too far, too fast. That makes him sloppy." Hannah blinked, unsure what to say. "We don't need to convince the world," Melissa continued. "We need to convince one judge. And you've already got the beginning of something strong." That conversation changed everything. For the first time in months, Hannah didn't feel like prey. She felt like someone with a plan. They worked tirelessly for the next few weeks. Melissa brought in a forensic accountant, and what they found in Gregory's transactions confirmed what Hannah already suspected: unreported income, asset transfers, and documents forged under Hannah's name. Bit by bit, the mask Gregory wore in public began to crack. Hannah stayed quiet, enduring more hearings, more smirks, and more humiliation. But beneath the surface, a shift had begun. Gregory didn't know it yet, but the same courtroom he once used to humiliate her was about to become the stage for his own undoing. And when the moment came, Hannah wouldn't raise her voice. She wouldn't need to. The truth would do it for her. At Melissa's suggestion, Hannah began keeping a journal, not for court, but for clarity. Each entry was a window into the decay of her marriage. She wrote about the time Gregory left her stranded at a gala for hours, the bruising words he whispered after arguments, the nights she cried silently in the bathroom while Abby slept. Releasing those memories onto paper was both painful and liberating. For years, she had lived under Gregory's shadow, molded into silence by fear and manipulation. But as she wrote, she remembered moments she had pushed aside: emails, messages, receipts. She returned to old cloud folders, scanned documents, and began organizing her life not as a victim, but as a witness. The diary quickly became more than therapy; it became a map. It helped her recall inconsistencies in Gregory's stories, timelines that didn't align, and voices that had once gone unnoticed. As her legal team pieced together the narrative, they saw clearly what Hannah had endured. The emotional abuse, the financial deception, the calculated isolation. Hannah had spent years buried beneath appearances. But now, in black ink on paper, the truth was rising to the surface. Slowly, steadily, she was taking ownership of her voice, and with it, the foundation of Gregory's false image began to shake. Outwardly, Gregory continued his charade. He smiled at school events, sent donations to local charities, and even took Abby on trips designed to impress teachers and court evaluators. Photos of their vacations flooded social media, carefully curated to present a narrative of the devoted father left behind by an unstable wife. Hannah saw them all. At first, they hurt. But over time, they became fuel. Each post was a performance, and performers make mistakes. Gregory didn't realize that the public image he flaunted contradicted statements he made in court about his income, his availability, even his parenting schedule. Hannah's team began cataloging every post, every caption, every timestamp. They aligned them with court documents and uncovered a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation. More importantly, they found indirect messages between Gregory and his mistress, Sylvia, disguised under fake business accounts. Hidden in the flattery and emojis were references to shifting funds, altering agreements, and ensuring H can't touch a cent. Melissa's voice was calm as she scrolled through them during their meeting. "He thought he was clever," she said. "He's not. He's arrogant. And that's our advantage." Hannah didn't smile. She didn't need to. She knew Gregory's silence in court would speak volumes soon. It was a rainy Tuesday when Hannah discovered an old phone in a storage box she'd nearly forgotten. It was her device from 2 years ago, long replaced but never wiped. When she charged it, she found hundreds of saved texts, conversations with Gregory from when their marriage was unraveling. Many were mundane, but others were explosive. One in particular stood out. Gregory had written, "If you leave me, I'll make sure everyone sees you as a lunatic. No judge will believe a word you say." At the time, Hannah had replied nothing. Now, she stared at the message, trembling, not with fear, but with vindication. She exported the messages, cross-checked them with other evidence, and forwarded them to Melissa. "This isn't just a threat," the lawyer said. "This is psychological warfare. And it's exactly what he's doing now." Included in those texts were references to bank transfers, burner email accounts, and even derogatory comments about Abby's teachers. Hannah had forgotten how often Gregory texted in anger, thinking his words disappeared into the void. But the void had a memory. And now it had proof. Hannah didn't need to shout. Her silence had been keeping receipts. Gregory's team requested an emergency hearing to address what they claimed was uncooperative behavior from Hannah. The motion was filled with vague accusations, missed visitation coordination, emotional instability, and refusal to comply with financial disclosures. Melissa wasn't surprised. "He's fishing," she said. "He's trying to rattle you. But this works in our favor. We'll give him the stage and pull the curtain when he least expects it." When Hannah entered the courtroom, Gregory smirked. He looked confident, comfortable in his tailored suit, his eyes scanning the room like a performer waiting for applause. But today, something was different. Melissa rose calmly and submitted their counter-evidence. The room fell silent as the judge reviewed a series of printed messages, social media screenshots, financial inconsistencies, and time-stamped contradictions. For the first time, Gregory shifted in his seat. Hannah watched his fingers tighten on the table. As Melissa spoke, she detailed not just one lie, but a pattern of manipulation and deceit. "Your Honor," she concluded, "this is not a case of miscommunication. This is strategic dishonesty." The judge didn't speak for a long moment. Then, in a measured tone, he ordered a recess. Hannah exhaled slowly. It had begun. After court, Gregory tried to approach Hannah. "Trying to play dirty now?" he hissed, his smile strained. She didn't answer. Melissa stepped between them. "This conversation is over," she said firmly, guiding Hannah away. Outside, the sky was overcast, but Hannah felt a strange clarity. For the first time in months, Gregory looked unsettled, not because he feared exposure, but because he hadn't expected her to fight back this way. He was used to power through dominance, not resistance through strategy. Hannah wasn't louder, she was smarter. And he didn't know how to handle that. That night, back in her apartment, Hannah lit a candle on the windowsill and sat at the edge of her bed. Abby's drawings were still on the fridge. Her favorite book still on the nightstand. Hannah picked it up and began reading out loud, as if her daughter were listening from a distance. Her voice didn't shake. She knew the time was coming when her story would no longer be whispered behind doors or drowned in Gregory's lies. A reckoning was forming, one built not on rage, but on truth. And truth, Hannah had learned, doesn't rush. It waits, then strikes with precision. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs when Melissa called an unexpected name to the stand: Avery Quinn. Gregory's expression froze. Avery had once worked in Gregory's real estate firm as a junior accountant. Quiet and overlooked, she had left the company under vague circumstances, but now, standing in court, she held a folder of emails and financial records that linked Gregory to offshore accounts, falsified statements, and fabricated debt transfers meant to frame Hannah as wasteful. Her voice didn't waver as she explained how Gregory often bragged that his wife was too naive to understand numbers and that he could drain her dry and make her thank him for it. Avery testified for nearly an hour, ending with a soft but firm statement: she never knew what he was doing. She just believed in him. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Gregory's lawyers whispered furiously, but nothing could undo what had been said under oath. The judge nodded slowly, visibly shaken by the implications. Gregory tried to maintain his composure, but his face betrayed the first real signs of panic. Hannah sat still, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She didn't look at Gregory. She didn't need to. The truth was no longer a whisper, it was speaking clearly, and people were finally listening. That evening, Gregory did something unexpected. He showed up at Hannah's apartment building. He didn't knock. He stood across the street, arms crossed, staring at the window as if hoping she'd appear. Hannah watched him through the blinds. There was no rage on his face this time, no arrogance. Only confusion. For a man who had built his identity on control, losing it unraveled him more quickly than anyone could have imagined. His calls became frequent, first angry, then pleading. He left voice messages, each more desperate than the last. "You don't know what you're doing," one began. Another said, "Can't we just fix this quietly?" But Hannah didn't answer. She forwarded everything to Melissa and blocked his number. Gregory had used their marriage to build a platform of power. Now that it was collapsing, he no longer knew how to function. His charisma couldn't erase documents. His smirks couldn't silence witnesses. In court, he'd begun losing his composure, interrupting statements, lashing out at questions. The judge had to issue a warning. Hannah remained composed, never reacting, never gloating. She had learned the hard way that real strength wasn't loud, it was unshakable presence. And as Gregory began to unravel, Hannah stood taller. The courtroom was tense when Melissa placed a printed document on the table. "Your Honor," she said, "we request permission to introduce this final piece of communication into evidence." It was a transcript of a conversation, one recorded with Gregory's accidental consent, during a phone call where he boasted to a friend about manipulating the court. He had laughed and said, "If she finds the money, I'll say she forged it. She's too polite to fight back anyway." The judge allowed it. Melissa turned to Gregory. "Do you want me to read it out loud, or shall we hand it directly to the court?" she asked. Gregory went pale. His lawyer tried to object, but it was overruled. Melissa didn't need to read the message. The judge was already reading. The courtroom shifted into stillness, every breath held. Gregory's hands shook. For the first time, he had no words. No smirk. No mask. Just silence. Hannah didn't smile, didn't even move. She simply looked forward, hands resting calmly in her lap. For years, he had spoken for her, over her, through her. Now, the truth was speaking for itself, and it didn't need to shout. At the next session, the judge offered Abby the opportunity to speak privately. Hannah hesitated, unsure if it was right to involve her child more deeply, but Abby insisted. "I want to talk," she said, her voice steady despite her young age. Inside chambers, Abby spoke with a quiet clarity that surprised even the judge. She described the nights with Gregory when she had to stay silent while he yelled on the phone. The way he'd brush her off with a tablet or TV remote instead of time. And how with her mother, she felt safe, read to, listened to, loved. The judge returned to the bench and spoke calmly. "I've heard what I needed to hear." Gregory's eyes widened. Hannah's heart pounded. In that moment, the weight of years lifted from her chest. The courtroom had been Gregory's weapon for months. He had used it to shame her, to strip her of dignity, to twist their story. But now, that very courtroom had become the place where truth stood firm, and where even a child's voice could cut through arrogance. The war was shifting. When the judge announced a temporary reversal of custody, Gregory slumped in his seat. Abby would return to Hannah's care immediately. The courtroom didn't erupt, it grew silent. That kind of silence doesn't come from victory, but from realization. Gregory's team asked for a recess, clearly unprepared for the depth of exposure. Hannah sat still, emotion flickering behind her calm expression. She had regained custody, but more than that, she had reclaimed her narrative. The woman once portrayed as unstable, emotional, and manipulative had stood in court with patience and precision, and it was Gregory who now seemed unhinged. Outside, as reporters gathered and murmurs spread, Gregory refused to speak. He looked smaller somehow, his voice quiet, his posture collapsed. He avoided cameras, muttered to his lawyers, and left without a word. Hannah stood near the courthouse steps, holding Abby's hand, watching the clouds drift slowly above. There were more hearings to come, but she no longer feared them. The tide had turned. The courtroom had once been Gregory's stage. Now, it was where his performance ended. Hannah sat on the edge of her bed that night, the soft light from a bedside lamp casting shadows across old photo frames scattered on the floor. She hadn't looked at them in years, pictures from their early marriage, vacations where she smiled beside a man already disappearing behind the image he crafted. As she traced her finger over one photo, she saw the difference in her own eyes. The woman smiling there had been hopeful, unaware of what was coming. But she wasn't bitter. She simply acknowledged how far she'd come from that naive hope. Those memories were no longer painful. They were lessons. She sorted through a box labeled keep and another marked let go. It was more than an act of organizing. It was closure. For every picture that reminded her of control, silence, or isolation, she placed it face down. She didn't burn them. She didn't erase the past. She simply removed its power to hurt her. Outside, the city moved on without knowing what Hannah had survived. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. She wasn't the woman left behind. She was the woman who stood up and walked forward. When news of Gregory's courtroom collapse leaked to local media, the headlines were cautious but clear: real estate mogul faces allegations in divorce court. Overnight, the narrative Gregory had so carefully built began to fracture. Reporters requested interviews, former business partners kept their distance, and invitations to charity galas stopped arriving. For years, Gregory had used charm and reputation to mask truth. Now, both were slipping from his grip. He issued a short statement, claiming privacy during a difficult time, but the damage was done. People were starting to whisper, not about Hannah, but about him. Melissa advised Hannah not to comment publicly. "Your silence says more than 1,000 interviews," she said. Hannah agreed. She had no desire for revenge or spotlight. All she wanted was peace, for herself and her daughter. But something had shifted. Strangers stopped her at the grocery store. One woman hugged her and said, "I followed the case." "You're brave." Hannah didn't feel brave. She felt tired, but that tiredness was no longer heavy. It was the tiredness that comes after lifting something that was never hers to carry alone. 3 weeks later, the final hearing arrived. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no grand gestures. Just documents, testimonies, and a ruling that laid everything bare. The judge ruled in Hannah's favor on all counts: full custody, spousal support, and a full audit of Gregory's financial practices. Additionally, sanctions were imposed on Gregory for presenting fraudulent information in court. He sat still, his hands trembling slightly, no longer pretending to be in control. For the first time, the courtroom saw him not as a successful man, but as a manipulator who had tried and failed to bury the truth. Hannah didn't cry when the judgment was read. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and breathed. It wasn't victory, it was freedom. Not the kind that comes with cheering, but the kind that lets you sleep at night without fear. Gregory left the courtroom in silence, avoiding eye contact. Hannah didn't watch him go. Instead, she gathered her papers, thanked the clerk, and walked out hand in hand with Abby. Outside, the air felt clearer. Not because the world had changed, but because she had. 2 days after the verdict, Hannah received an unexpected knock at her door. When she opened it, Gregory stood there, unshaven, worn, holding a small folder. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the ground, then at her, eyes hollow. "I came to say I was wrong," he muttered. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I was cruel. I lied. I destroyed the best thing I ever had." His voice cracked. Hannah stood in silence, watching the man who once tried to destroy her now unable to stand tall. She didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, she said, "I don't hate you, Gregory. But I don't forgive you to make you feel better. I forgive you because I don't want to carry you anymore." She didn't invite him in. She didn't ask questions. She simply closed the door gently, leaving him standing alone on the porch. That moment wasn't about closure. It was about choosing peace over poison. Hannah no longer needed revenge. She had something far more powerful: clarity. With the court behind her and Gregory out of their daily lives, Hannah began rebuilding, not just routines, but meaning. She and Abby moved to a smaller home near a quiet park. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. They painted the walls together, planted flowers, and created new traditions: Saturday pancakes, library afternoons, evening walks. The laughter returned slowly, like sunlight after a storm. Abby seemed lighter, her questions less fearful. "Are we safe now?" she once whispered. Hannah hugged her and said, "We are. We really are." She started attending community support groups, not as a victim, but as someone others looked to. People came to her asking how she found the strength to fight, how she stayed composed. Her answer was always the same: "I didn't stay strong every day. But I didn't give up." And as she built a new life brick by brick, Hannah realized something unexpected: she had become someone she once admired. Not because she had one, but because she had never surrendered her voice. Some weeks after the final hearing, Hannah received an email from a local nonprofit that supported women leaving abusive relationships. A staff member had followed her case and asked if she'd consider consulting on their outreach program. At first, she hesitated. She didn't see herself as an expert, just someone who had survived. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how rare it was to come out of something like that and still feel whole. She accepted the invitation, unsure of where it would lead. What started as a few hours a week soon grew into workshops, one-on-one mentorship, and finally, a part-time role with the organization. In those quiet, shared rooms, surrounded by women who bore different scars but knew the same silence, Hannah found meaning. She didn't offer advice. She offered presence. She listened, and when she spoke, her words came not from theory, but from lived pain and resilience. Abby, too, thrived in their new rhythm. Her grades improved, her drawings filled the refrigerator again, and laughter returned to their home like an old friend who had waited patiently outside the door. Life wasn't perfect. But it was real and peaceful. And that peace, after everything, felt like the greatest form of wealth. One afternoon, while waiting for a friend at a bookstore cafe, Hannah heard a familiar voice ordering coffee behind her. She turned slowly and saw Daniel, an old college friend she hadn't seen in over a decade. They exchanged surprised smiles, and soon, they were seated across from each other, talking as if no time had passed. Daniel had moved back to the city after a divorce of his own and was now working with an educational startup focused on community outreach. As the conversation deepened, Hannah realized how easy it felt, natural, unforced, safe. It was the first time in years she felt that way with someone. They kept in touch. Slowly, carefully. There were no grand gestures or romantic rushes. Just long walks, honest conversations, and mutual respect. Daniel never asked about Gregory unless she brought it up, and when she did, he listened, not to fix, but to understand. One day, as they walked through the park with Abby skipping ahead of them, Daniel turned to her and said, "You know, I always admired how grounded you were back then. Now I see why." Hannah didn't respond with words. She just smiled, letting the wind carry the moment. It wasn't a new love story. It was the quiet return of trust. Months passed, and one evening Hannah was invited to speak at a small community event. She stood on a modest stage, facing a group of strangers, some survivors, some supporters, some just curious. She took a deep breath, held the microphone gently, and said, "There was a time when I thought silence was strength. That enduring quietly made me a better partner, a better mother. But I've learned that silence, when used to protect someone else's lie, only deepens the wound." Her voice didn't tremble. It rang steady and clear, echoing through the room. She didn't talk about Gregory by name. She didn't need to. She talked about reclaiming identity, choosing peace over pride, and the quiet power of saying, "I will not disappear." After her speech, people came up to her, some in tears, others simply nodding with understanding. One young woman whispered, "I thought I was the only one." Hannah placed a hand on her shoulder and replied, "You never were. You never will be." It wasn't about being heroic. It was about being honest. And in honesty, she had found not just her voice, but her purpose. Occasionally, Hannah still saw Gregory, at school events, from a distance in court-mandated drop-offs, or mentioned in news blurbs about his declining real estate empire. He no longer met her eyes. He arrived quietly, left quickly, spoke only when required. The man who once filled every room with ego now slipped in and out of places like a shadow. Abby noticed the difference too. She asked fewer questions about him. One day, she simply said, "I think Dad is sad." Hannah responded carefully, "Some people carry sadness when they've lost themselves." Abby nodded and went back to her drawing. Gregory never publicly apologized again. He didn't challenge the final rulings, nor did he reach out in letters or messages. It was as if he had finally realized that no version of power could rewrite what had already been spoken in truth. For Hannah, his silence was enough. It wasn't victory, it was consequence. And with each passing month, the memory of his presence in her life became less sharp, less painful. He had once tried to define her through shame. Now, he had no more words left to use. On a sunny morning in early spring, Hannah and Abby walked hand in hand through a local street fair. Music played softly from speakers strung between lampposts, children laughed nearby, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. It had been over a year since the trial ended. They paused at a booth selling handmade notebooks. Abby picked one up and asked, "Can I use this to write our new life story?" Hannah smiled and said, "You can write anything you want. This life is yours, too." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Abby rested her head on her mother's shoulder and whispered, "Are you happy now?" Hannah looked at the horizon, the golden light warming her face, and said softly, "Yes. Finally, I am." In that moment, everything felt complete, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been transformed. From silence into truth. From pain into peace. And from survival into something far greater, life, fully lived.